on Wall Street for tracking, measuring, rating, and profiting from ESG. This includes rating agencies, consultants, accountants, proxy agents, and investment managers. For investment managers, the ESG movement has been especially lucrative. It allows them to charge higher fees because ESG funds are actively managed.
Large Wall Street banks are not charitable institutions. They expect something in return for that. And then you look at which firms are rewarded with government packages like who gets the COVID-19 stimulus packages. A lot of that flowed through BlackRock.
What we're seeing is a new revolving door in Washington. We're seeing liberal activists, whether they're in the administration or on Capitol Hill, instead of leaving those positions and going to K Street to become lobbyists in Washington, what we're seeing now is they're going to Wall Street.
And even cannibalism. The authorities prevented villagers from traveling to the cities in search of food. Many people starved to death as they walked along the railways. The Holodomor famine turned more than 1 million Ukrainian children into orphans. Many of them became homeless and had no choice but to beg for food in the cities. To eliminate this embarrassment, Stalin signed orders authorizing police to shoot children as young as 12. Estimates of the death toll during the Holodomor range from about 2.5 million to 4.8 million. During the famine, bodies of the victims could be seen all over the streets of Kharkov, the Ukrainian capital. Its own followers. This played out during the Stalinist era, as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union carried out bloody purges across its own ranks. Beginning in 1928, Stalin targeted the upper echelons of the communist leadership. Out of the 1,966 delegates to the 17th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1934, 1,108 were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. Of the 139 members of the Central Committee elected at the 17th Congress, 4 out of every 5 were shot. The Soviet Politburo had elected 31 members between 1919 and 1935, of whom 20 were killed in Stalin's purges. Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, once said, "Show me the man, and I'll find you the crime." Except for Stalin, all of the Politburo members remaining at the time of Lenin's death in 1924, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, Alexei Rykov, Mikhail Tomsky, and Leon Trotsky, were executed or assassinated by 1940. No section of society was spared in the Great Terror. Repression in the religious, scientific, educational, academic, and artistic fields preceded the purges that gutted the military and political elite.
Was established in 2019. What we found out at this conference in Washington today was that the United States had a policy to destroy our church. This was news. It came out of a session which involved a former Assistant Secretary of State who said that such behavior was a violation of the American Constitution, which I would certainly agree with. And he spoke about government policies that were developed to destroy this church because of the American foreign policy interest in reducing the power of the Russian Orthodox Church. So they took it upon themselves to foment this division and split in the church and work with authorities in Ukraine to bring this new church, which is autocephalous, completely Ukrainian, bring this new church into existence in 2019 and basically destroy the church that had been around for 1,000 years. So we're still reeling from this news because while we had suspected it, we were shocked that a former member of the government would come out and say things like this. It explains to some extent, the wild behavior of Ukraine, which is with impunity. You know, they are passing a law that violates every international human rights treaty known to man. What they are doing in Ukraine, you cannot legally do. You just, it's like driving 90 in a 60 zone. You just can't do it. You can't ban a church. If you think people in Ukraine are in any way susceptible to Russian propaganda, then you can charge them with a crime. You can investigate and charge them. But you can't ban an entire religion. So, we have been begging people of faith to stand up and speak to these legislators in Ukraine and tell them to rethink these terrible policies. Amazingly, at this conference in Washington, they invited a Mr. Zelensky, who is in fact the author of this bill, to close the church. So why they invited him and gave him the floor at a policy conference on religious freedom is beyond me. So that is the update of where we are. Things are no better and only worse. We have a website now called Save the UOC, where you will be able to download a white paper we've written on the situation there, as well as a further analysis of this new law, which demonstrates that it is completely contrary to international law and human rights.
Bob, this is stunning. What a mind.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. For the field day, for the heat, 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that?
They call regenerative agriculture. The push for regenerative agriculture comes from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They stated that in order to reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, there must be deep reductions in agricultural emissions.
Over the past few years, Nestle has launched a series of pilot programs in over a dozen markets, all with the idea that working closely with farmers such as David, emissions can be reduced at the source.
Before you scale things up, you have to actually go through a period of intense trial and error and piloting solutions. So this is where farms like these come in that are very close to our global research center, and with farmers that are highly educated and willing to explore new ways of farming.
Nestle has committed to investing $1.3 billion in regenerative agricultural programs over the next 3 years.
It's a way of planting crops where you rotate your crops, you have cover crops, and what happens is that the soil actually, every time you harvest, gets richer and richer, and it also is able to hold water much better. So what happens is, when a climate-induced superstorm comes by, the regenerative ag farms are doing just fine.
Own land. But after murdering the landowners, the CCP claimed the land was to be turned over to the peasants in the form of cooperatives. In practice, this meant the land still did not belong to the peasants. In March 1950, the CCP issued the Directive on the Strict Suppression of Counter-Revolutionary Elements, also known as the Campaign to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries, which focused on killing the landlords and rich peasants in the countryside.
And it's going to be...
Are world leaders correct? Are we now living in of a chronic decline in our living standards? Will the things that we once had in abundance become increasingly unaffordable?
Developing news on the sky-high cost of gasoline. The average price of a gallon of self-serve regular gasoline creeping up to a record high again this morning, topping the previous high set June 14th.
Now they are skyrocketing again, about to hit a new record high. People are angry, frustrated.
While world leaders blame Russia, the root causes of this crisis go back well before the invasion of Ukraine.
Gas prices will remain very high, and it also may result in some disruption.
We cannot magically get sort of tens or hundreds of gigawatts of renewable energy before winter. So it is a matter of saving energy. It's a matter of securing sources.
There should be more obligatory measures to reduce consumption.
I think the effect of this crisis will be that Europe will be further down the path to emissions reductions than it would otherwise be.
ESG is not an investment strategy. It's a disinvestment strategy. What ESG does is it goes to corporations and it tells them to get out of the business that they're actually in. For example, Exxon, pushing them out of the oil and gas discovery and recovery business, delivering reliable, affordable gasoline to American consumers, and pushes them into ridiculous, supposedly green energy products that don't have a high return on investment, don't work for the American consumer.
The nominees by Exxon of its board of directors were challenged by a small investment activist group called Engine Number One. Now, Engine Number One was backed by BlackRock, it was backed by State Street, it was backed by CalPERS and the pension funds. Those three activist challengers were successfully elected to the board with BlackRock and State Street backing and assistance. Brought in explicitly on a slate to move Exxon away from being a reliable energy producer, the king of reliable energy producers, and instead wasted shareholders' money on technologies that aren't particularly clean, certainly aren't reliable, and certainly aren't yet anything like feasible.
Investment in America's oil and gas industry has been steadily declining as the United States systematically restricts the supply of capital and reduces its ability to produce fossil fuels. America's ability to refine oil has also experienced a dramatic decline in the past several years as refineries close across the U.S. American refining capacity has fallen by more than 1 million barrels per day since 2020. Part of the reason is overinvestment in energy production before the pandemic, which caused fossil fuel prices to plummet and pushed some oil companies into bankruptcy. But much of this decline stems from the fact that
this summit is going on, and then someone at the summit is basically there who has written the law that they're seeking to pass to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
They probably want to do it here, too.
I guess my question would be, why would that be done, and why would that not be refuted and denied?
Listen, to be honest, a number of the speakers are scratching their heads. This guy was given the podium at a conference like this. But, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, we are blind to the excesses of the Zelensky government. He is about to fire the general that saved Kiev. No one in Ukraine understands why he's doing it. It's just like this banning of the UOC. Yeah, I think, I want to be honest and fair. I think there are a lot of people in Ukraine today who probably support the ban because there's a virulent hatred of Russia And the fact that our church had some connection with it, undoubtedly.
Create dependence. Right? Dependent people are much easier to control than independent people, and that goes back to the war on farming too. I think that's one of the reasons they want to wipe out the independent producers. Independent people can say no. Right? People who are dependent on government, on mega corporations, do not have that ability. If your children are hungry, you'll be willing to give up just about anything, any freedom, any property.
What we're dealing now with is excessive speculation driving oil prices up, not supply in demand.
We're seeing the same thing in the United States too, just not quite at as large a scale. But for example, the Biden administration knocking out big parts of our energy supply and big parts of our energy infrastructure, even our electricity generation, under the guise of saving us from global warming. They say, oh, look, power prices are surging. Well, now you can't afford your electricity. Well, hey, I have an idea. Let's expand the welfare system so that you can now afford your electricity. And we see people like Senator Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders saying that the reason prices are going up is because evil capitalists are ripping you off.
There's no time for profiteering or price gouging. I want to be clear about what we'll not tolerate.
These are big arc increases that really hit a budget hard. This is the reason that we need Build Back Better.
Yeah, right.
People's Commune Movement and the Great Leap Forward campaign. These wild schemes, which depleted grain stocks and decimated Chinese agricultural production, were supported by a deluge of false reports written by officials across all levels of leadership, from rural regions to the cities.
Sounds
the
like
CCP
the Democrats
justification
today.
for collecting grain from the peasants, who were forced to turn in their food, seeds, and animal feed to the regime. The CCP's administrative organs at all levels sent teams to the countryside. They used torture and interrogations to squeeze the last morsels of food from the doomed peasants. Following the example set by the Soviet communists, the CCP prevented villagers from entering cities in search of food, causing the mass death of families and even whole villages. Cannibalism was widespread, and the corpses of famine victims littered the countryside. When peasants were caught stealing to survive, they were killed. The grain seized by the government was traded for large amounts of Soviet weaponry, or for gold that the CCP used to pay off debts, as it turned a blind eye to the loss of Chinese lives. In just 3 years, the Great Chinese Famine had wiped out tens of millions of people.
Another example of grotesque corruption in terms of what's going on with Ukraine. We have granted Ukraine complete impunity. There are no checks and balances. And while I support Ukraine and believe they must get the arms they need for an existential battle, I do wonder why we can't have some control over what's happening in terms of the money and the resources we're shipping over. And certainly I believe people of faith in the United States should be talking to their priests, their rabbis, people of religious activity to make their voices heard that banning this 1,000-year-old church simply is just not what people of faith do to their brethren.
We're talking about the fact that the Ukrainian government under Volodymyr Zelensky is actually trying to ban this church. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to find out what a ban would mean for the thousands of people who are members of this particular church, and then again try to find out why you would do that when men and women who are members of this church are actually losing their lives in defense of Ukraine. Back with more in just a moment.
7.73 million people. Dong Baoshun, an associate professor of China's Shandong University, and Ding Longjia, deputy director of the Shandong Party History Research Office, co-authored a 1997 book titled Exonerate the Innocent, Rehabilitate the Wrongly Accused and Sentenced. It quoted Ye Jianying, the vice president of the CCP Central Committee, as making the following statements during the closing ceremony of the Central Working Conference on December 13, 1978. Quote, 2 years and 7 months of comprehensive investigation by the Central Committee have determined that 20 million people died in the Cultural Revolution. Over 100 million suffered political persecution, and 800 billion yuan were wasted. According to the selected works of Deng Xiaoping from August 21st to 23rd, 1980, CCP leader Deng Xiaoping gave 2 interviews with Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci in the Great Hall of the People. Fallaci asked, quote, "How many people died in the Cultural Revolution?" Deng replied, quote, "How many people really died in the Cultural Revolution? The figure is astronomical and can never be estimated." Deng described a typical case. Kang Sheng, the head of the CCP's secret police, accused the party secretary of Yunnan province, Zhao Jianmin, of treason and of being an agent of the Kuomintang. Not only was Zhao imprisoned, but his downfall also impacted 1.38 million people throughout the province, of whom 17,000 were persecuted to death and 60,000 were beaten to the point of disability.
1,000 banded central and then 3,000 is
The artificial when you look at the mansion. And the fact that ISIS is now spreading its tentacles, their place around Libya, and leads the way in the role of Christians who are persecuted. What's going on here? Why can't U.S. forces as well as other forces, including the Nigerian military, why can't they get their arms wrapped around this and stop the spread of this kind of radical behavior?
That's such a good question, and it's been going on since 2009. Of course, land grabbing by radicalized Muslims has been going on for 30 years. But the fact is, the Nigerian government itself is not committing to ending the insurgency. And some people theorize that the agencies of the security forces, like the Army, the Navy, and the police forces, they actually make a lot of money by having an endless war in their own country that they always manage, but they never quite win that war. But it just keeps on going. And some people argue that the elements in the government have encouraged it because they are of a radicalist persuasion, although they'll say to the contrary, on the podium. That's the problem.
So we're talking about perpetuating warfare and perpetuating a radical Islamic group or groups, Boko Haram, ISIS, going into Christian occupied areas. And in some cases, as I understand it, Christians and Muslims live side by side, and they face untold consequences if they work together from ISIS and other groups that would attack the Christians as well as attack Muslims who perhaps side with Christians in defending their right to practice their faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a minority of the Muslims that are radicalized. Nigeria is a big country. It's the most populous country in Africa and major U.S. ally. It's got 218 million people, about 46% are Christian. And yeah, they live side by side in many areas, including the ravaged Middle Belt. But there is a small criminalized group, which happens to be chiefly of one ethnicity. It's the ethnicity of the former president, Muhammadu Buhari. And this radicalized group has a sectarian objective, which is to conquer the Christians and to force their conversion or to force them to leave, as well as an economic objective. So that's what folks are not completely understanding, is that for the bandits and even for ISIS itself, this is a business, and this is a quest for political.
The free world took in the party's lies, giving the persecutors free rein to commit the worst crimes. In the persecution of Falun Gong, the CCP introduced an evil never before seen: live organ harvesting. As the largest group of people imprisoned for their faith in China, Falun Gong practitioners are killed on demand, cut open on the operating tables of state and military hospitals, and their organs are sold for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. On July 7, 2006, Canadian lawyers David Matas and David Kilgour, former Canadian Secretary of State Asia Pacific, published a report titled Bloody Harvest: The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs. Examining 18 types of evidence, they shed light on the CCP's monstrosity, calling it, quote, a disgusting form of evil new to this planet. Matas and Kilgour, working with international investigators, published the report An Update to the Slaughter and Bloody Harvest in June 2016. Running over 680 pages and containing more than 2,400 references, it proved beyond any doubt the reality and scale of the live organ harvesting carried out by the Chinese Communist regime. On June 13, 2016, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed Resolution 343, demanding the CCP bring an immediate end to the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience. The lucrative organ transplant business sustained support for the persecution of Falun Gong and attracted clients from China and around the world, making them part of the CCP's mass murder. 4.
Create dependence. Right? Dependent people are much easier to control than independent people, and that goes back to the war on farming too. I think that's one of the reasons they want to wipe out the independent producers. Independent people can say no. Right? People who are dependent on government, on mega corporations, do not have that ability. If your children are hungry, you'll be willing to give up just about anything, any freedom, any property.
What we're dealing now with is excessive speculation driving oil prices up, not supply in demand.
We've seen the same thing in the United States too, just not quite at as large a scale. But for example, the Biden administration knocking out big parts of our energy supply and big parts of our energy infrastructure, even our electricity generation, under the guise of saving us from global warming. They say, oh, look, power prices are surging. Well, now you can't afford your electricity. Well, hey, I have an idea. Let's expand the welfare system so that you can now afford your electricity. And we see people like Senator Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders saying that the reason prices are going up is because evil capitalists are ripping you off.
There's no time for profiteering or price gouging. I want to be clear about what we'll not tolerate.
These are big arc increases that really hit a budget hard. This is the reason that we need Build Back Better.
Yeah, right.
Of communist regimes around the world. It verified a figure of 94 million, including the following: 20 million in the Soviet Union, 65 million in China, 1 million in Vietnam, 2 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1 million in Eastern Europe, 150,000 in Latin America, mainly Cuba, 1.7 million in Ethiopia, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, 10,000 due to, quote, the international communist movement and communist parties not in power. Apart from Russia and China, lesser communist regimes have shown themselves no less willing to engage in absolute evil. The Cambodian genocide is the most extreme mass murder carried out by a communist government. According to various estimates, the number of Cambodians killed by Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime ranges from 1.4 million to 2.2 million, up to one-third of Cambodia's population at the time. Between 1948 and 1987, the North Korean communists killed more than 1 million of their own people through forced labor, executions, and internment in concentration camps. In the
realized that the old threat to their monopoly power used to come from the left in this country. And, you know, the left was skeptical of the aggregation of corporate power. Citizens United in 2010. Break up big tech. That was a left-wing slogan before it was a right-wing slogan. Okay, but what technology companies realized was that, you know what? We can actually protect our monopoly power if we advance the objectives of the people who view us as their enemies. So we'll censor content. We'll take down speech, hate speech, misinformation that you don't want to see on the internet, but we don't do it for free.
Government
We
provides
effectively
more
expect
than you
that people
think.
go the other way to leave our monopoly power intact.
What they get is this possibility that knowing that the market is now rigged, you're not really mostly worried about customers or shareholders. Your primary concern is who has my back. And the state is that entity who will bail you out if necessary, support your efforts, and help you to get rid of competitors, as in the case of social media. We see the collusion going on between the federal government and Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. These federal agencies put pressure on Facebook to censor particular viewpoints. Those companies that reflect and reiterate state narratives will be rewarded, and those that don't will be punished.
Federal judge giving the White House 21 days to turn over emails from officials, including Dr. Tony Fauci and Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, that were sent to social media companies. It's all part of a lawsuit filed by attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana, accusing the administration of colluding with big technology companies to censor information on Hunter Biden's laptop, COVID-19, free speech on elections, you name it, they censored it.
I believe this may be one of the biggest cases to reach the United States Supreme Court in this century. Why? Because if the government can compel media outlets on what they can and can't say, and what the media sees and doesn't see, or reads and doesn't read, then we are absolutely in a tyrannical style government.
This is one of the most important lawsuits, I think, of maybe our lifetime. The government has fought tooth and nail to prevent the public from finding out how they are pressuring private social media companies. This has really just emerged in the last few weeks as part of this litigation. And I think one of the reasons why there hasn't been as much litigation in the past is I just don't think people realize, or it didn't dawn on them, the degree of the bad behavior by these companies and their collusion with each other, and the degree to which the government has been leaning on them as well.
We know that the government doesn't have the ability to censor speech, force these companies or compel these companies, and they do so under duress, because we know that they regulate these companies. We know the power of the federal government. And look, what we found since then is that this reached into the law enforcement arm of the federal government, the FBI and the Department of Justice. They're doing everything they can to scratch and claw and fight to keep us from getting any of this information. Remember, this is our government, supposedly. And so, the U.S. Department of Justice and Attorney General are claiming that there's some sort of privilege to the information that we're looking for. I would remind the U.S. Attorney General that there is no privilege for violating an American's First Amendment rights.
We see this in these cases where the government has leaned on these, Twitter, Facebook, these companies to censor speech that the government deems misinformation. And it's pretty clear that they're not just suggesting. That they've got all kind of regulatory tools, and they've shown a willingness to use them to force their will on private actors. And that's why this case is so important. Is we need to start taking this problem of the regulatory state seriously, and recognize that the old ideas of how we try to regulate government action may not be enough to understand the lawlessness and the abusiveness of the modern regulatory state.
While state AGs pursue legal remedies, a growing number of states have now introduced or passed laws against ideological investing of state pension money, effectively prohibiting ESG investments from public funds. In August, the state of Florida went one step further and took away the ability of asset managers to vote the shares owned by Florida pensioners and employees, as well as prohibiting political discrimination against employees. A public spat between the Disney Corporation and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made headlines in April when Disney CEO Bob Chapek publicly fought against the Florida law that prohibits teaching of sexual topics to children in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade.
Do you feel the bills getting higher and higher every time you check out at the supermarket? Do you feel your monthly discretionary money has decreased, although your income increases yearly? Inflation is eating away at your wealth.
Global World Forum. This is the United States of America. We intend to elect, through an election system, through a democratic process, people that go to Congress or go to our state capitals. We elect governors and presidents to basically execute the policies that are created in our capitals in a transparent manner, right? Remember, laws are created through a very transparent, open forum. We don't know what goes on in these corporate boardrooms. We don't know the background of these people. We don't know the underlying investments or the other kind of maybe nefarious activities that may be going on.
Other conservative states have joined in the effort to fight ESG, even as liberal states double down on their support for it. Wall Street giants like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, JP Morgan, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley have become the subject of state efforts to stop discriminatory lending and ideological investing. West Virginia has been one of the leading states in this effort.
If we find a financial institution that is boycotting the fossil fuel industry, they refuse to lend money or finance the fossil fuel industry just based on this